Players gather to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most revered in the history of Magic the Gathering. Cephalid Illusionist, Gaia Reach Sanitarium, Nadu, Winged Wisdom, and many others, battling head-to-head in brutal combat. They all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and the search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by the minds behind Bosch & Roll on YouTube, Thraben University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by 3-for-1 Trading and Sparks Law Practice.
Hello, and welcome to episode 139 of the Eternal Glory podcast, another Eternal Weekend. We've already recorded 30 minutes of introduction and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. I'm Phil Gallagher, aka Thraben U.
I am Brian Coval, aka Bosch & Roll.
And I am Bryant Cook of the Epic Storm.
Shout out to all our new Patreon and YouTube members. Since the last episode, we've got Beam, Luke, Michael L., Lord Pepsi. Wow, the king of all Pepsi is among us. We're really moving up in the world. And Raphael M. Thanks to all of them, they get to enjoy stories from Prague Eternal Weekend and other stuff that we talked about in the pre-show.
And thanks to one of our sponsors, Sparks Law, a business transactional law firm owned by Eternal Magic community member Jonathan Sparks. If you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or gig worker looking to start your own company, Sparks Law can help with partnership agreements, contract reviews, intellectual property protection, or any other business legal questions. If you want to shape your business strategy with a fellow Eternal gamer, reach out via email to jsparks, that's JSPARKS at sparkslawpractice.com, or call 470-268-5234.
And if you would like to advertise to 10,000 plus Eternal gamers every episode, reach out to us. We're always accepting new sponsors.
And from our patrons, we are going to start off the episode with a few Patreon questions, which is something that patrons are allowed to send us. The first is from Josh, who asks, I was wondering how you can tell the difference between a deck that can be lovingly crafted, tuned, and piloted to success compared to a deck participating in an archetype that has a concrete performance ceiling. Thinking about the difference between Bryant earning a 70% win rate on the Epic Storm versus the field, or Joe L's Reanimator Sneak-In Show that Brian, made a video on recently, and comparing those against something like Pox, which has a dedicated community but never makes an appearance in tournaments. Well, Bryant, you were called out by name here as someone who boasts a completely unreasonable win rate. If the deck carried this win rate across the field, it would be banned. But what are you doing as just the premier pilot of a deck to carry a 70% win rate, 2 years in a row, walking into Eternal Weekend with different builds and different versions of the format?
Yeah, so I think most decks have a ceiling, and I would agree with that. And there's usually a difference in any deck, from Dimir Reanimator to Eldrazi Stompy to Painter, of the top pilot and the bottom pilot. And I mentioned this a couple episodes ago where I was talking about my win rate against the field. You'll run into people that are like, oh, but how do you do against Brian Coval on Stifle Knot? It's like, well, I'm not going to face Brian Coval every single round. I'm going to face Joe Smith one round, and maybe if I'm lucky, I'll face Brian Coval in a win-in for Eternal Weekend top 8. And you have to get a little bit more lucky against the Brian Covals of the world, or hit some good variants, where against the people that might not be as familiar with their deck, that's where you need to leverage your play skill. So there's going to be ebbs and flows, and you're not going to always beat a deck a certain percentage of the time. But I think one thing I do really well is maximizing small things. And this is what I love about my tutoring sessions, is finding those little bits and pieces to get you from 80% optimal all the way up to 95. Like, hey, did you think about if your opponent just happens to have Surgical Extraction here, you probably should have put those 2 cards on top instead? Or what about this X, Y, or Z? And just planning out every little niche case that could happen to you. And if it's free to play around, do it. Or if it's worthwhile to play around, do that. And I think once you start optimizing, you get from 70, 80% all the way up to 95. And that's when you see your win rate grow over time. And I find that stuff super rewarding.
I think if you're looking to quantify this, I think looking at matchup spread is really, really useful. So let's use current Death and Taxes, for example. Current Death and Taxes really, really struggles against the various Nadu decks, right? And just generally speaking has a really, really bad combo matchup, even if it dedicates most of its, 14, counting the Orion sideboard slots towards improving those matchups. And so when you look at the data and you can just see, I have a really bad matchup versus a very important part of the field, that is something that might be showing you that your deck's performance is currently capped. And if you do something like track data over time, and you kind of see patterns over the course of multiple different metagames, be that ban waves or new set releases or whatever, you can probably start to build some conclusions about the deck's floor versus ceiling versus average performance.
Phil, that's a really great recommendation. And I do keep track of all my own data. So I do get to see that. And I've been able to see it ever since 2017 when I started. I basically use my spreadsheet as fantasy baseball on myself to see where are my weaknesses, what can I work on, things like that. And it helps me finesse or tune my sideboard in the long run. But I do think, and this is going to sound cruel, and I'll use the example that the person provided with Pox, which is some decks just have a cap or a ceiling, and sometimes they're just lower. And I think if you enjoy playing Pox, there's nothing wrong with that. You should play what you love. Legacy is the format where you do get to do a lot of that. I played the Epic Storm. I don't play Dimir Reanimator, for example. But if you know that your deck is not capable of day twoing an event or anything like that, you have to accept that when you enter. You might have more fun, but hey, maybe this isn't the most competitive thing you could have done.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback on the first thing Bryant said, and then also the second thing Bryant said, which is together with making good decisions and playing really well against the lower skill or lower experience players, you'll hear people say skill diff, which is skill differential of maybe we have the exact same 75, but I'm going to use my cards better than you. It is what we're talking about as an advantage there. And maybe my deck's a little bit worse than yours, but I'm a lot better at Legacy than you are. And I could still beat you more often than not because I'm using my cards better. And a deck like Pox or Nick Fit, and I think Nick Fit was also shouted out in the pre-show in some sort of derogatory fashion. Sorry, Nick Fit, you're really just getting kicked here. But these are decks where having the Dark Ritual, Thoughtseize, Hymn to Turok open is so much more powerful than Swamp Thoughtseize is, and then Swamp Hymn to Turok on the next turn. And even that might be too slow, or when Nick Fit opens on the Cabal Therapy and you blind hit successfully, then turn to Veteran Explorer Flashback Therapy, now we're cooking. Those draws, sometimes your opening hand just doesn't have an Explorer in it, or doesn't have a Cabal Therapy. And you're not really leveraging agency, because your deck just shows you the cards you get to play with this game, and all you could do is mulligan. And there is a skill set of decks. I'm not saying you have to have Brainstorm in your deck to have agency. There is a skill set that Phil is quite good at, of knowing when to mulligan, knowing when to chase that nut 5 over this 6 with a plan, or the 7 with no hand or with no plan, but it's, boy, is it 7 cards. I like 7 cards, which is how I tend to mulligan. And there are skill testing moments there, but once the hand is kept, it's kind of here we are. This is what you get. And if your opponent can ponder and brainstorm and dance all around and move cards around and leave up Veil of Summer if you're the Epic Storm, or shuffle it away if they know that's not important to the matchup, does the Epic Storm know that it's a matchup they could send Echo of Eons quickly And that's the plan versus Sculpt, because they're under no pressure and just have a perfect hand on turn 7. All of those things are things that deck allows Bryant to do, where somebody playing Pox who just like draws 1 card every turn, maybe it's a basic swamp and then they pass the turn, or maybe it's Liliana and they do something really cool. Just the agency in a deck, agency intersecting with skill diff is where I find success with a lot of weird archetypes. And the question asked about Bryant and Joe L., who has been working on Reanimator Secret Show and trophies 1 or 2 leagues a week with it when nobody else is really playing it. Those are decks that let the pilot make decisions against what they're facing, where a deck like Pox or Nickfit might not get as many decisions to make.
One final thing, and this is a little bit of a tangent here, is Brian picked on 2 decks that have something similar, Nickfit and Pox. They're both decks that play discard spells. In the year 2024, I can't think of a time period in which discard spells were worse. And it's not because of Veil of Summer or anything else. It's the power level of every single card in your opponent's deck just being absolutely disgusting. And, a decade ago, you used to be able to play turn 1 Thoughtseize, take your opponent's best card and leave them with like 4 or 5 cards that just didn't really do much. Now Phil's going to untap and play Lelia off the top, followed by some other creature that has initiative, followed by, something even better the next turn. And
the One Ring.
Yeah, exactly. And the threats now are so insane that everything snowballs, and you can't afford to just have the opponent's top of their deck beat you over and over again. So, like, if you're going to play discard spells, they're sort of to punch a hole and then do your own powerful thing really quickly, which is why decks like Ad Nauseam Tendrils did well in Eternal Weekend this past weekend. We'll get to that a little bit later, but just like, I want to play Cabal Therapy and just guess the right name of the thing, which in a format with a million free counter spells and interaction these days, like, good luck. Like, this isn't a decade ago where Force of Will was the only thing either. Like, I just think Cabal Therapy has aged so poorly.
Also imagine Dark Ritualing out a Hymn to Troc and your opponent discards Archon of Cruelty. Game. And before Archon of Cruelty, it was Uro. Like, before the format got really fast, the format was really slow. Like, decks like that have just not worked that well for quite some time, because like Brian said, cards are just all worth many cards now.
All right, final thing. When you are trying to evaluate your deck, figuring out whether or not you are going to catch stray bullets from other things in the metagame matters a lot. So there's been a lot of times recently where I've played some really cool graveyard deck or some really cool artifact deck, and then I just got my face just repeatedly punched in by Consigned to Memories or Fairy Macabres or Surgical Extractions or Meltdowns or Null Rods or Stony Silences. So, like, if you are trying to do something cool and interesting, but you are taking collateral damage from, the best deck or the second best deck, you might have an artificial ceiling on your deck's performance in the short term, and it might be that you shelf that idea for 6 months and come back to it later.
Right. At Eternal Weekend Pittsburgh, my first 2 rounds were against Hogak and 4-color Punishing Loam. And it was just like, did you guys not get the memo that every deck is main decking 2 Nile Spellbombs at this point? And like decks like that are just tough. Let's get on to the next question. And this one does include some language that I wouldn't normally say in public, but it is part of the question, so I'm going to read it as written. Rob asks, I heard lots of reports of I had all good opponents except for this one guy at Eternal Weekend. People slow playing, trying to get their opponent's game losses on normal sleeveware from the day, asking questions often on repeat to try to throw people off their game, notably also being too uncomfortable to call a judge, with a whole group around them yucking it up over comments like I'm grabbing the pussy when they reach for Luris. What do you do when you don't know how to tell a judge that your opponent's behavior seems inappropriate? What are some key things to say to tip the judge off that your opponent is trying to win by means other than playing Magic? When is it right to try to work through it versus call a judge? And how do you explain what's going on? And how do you compose yourself during a judge call?
I would like to go first, if that's okay.
Get in there.
Yeah, call the judge immediately. If your opponent says I'm grabbing the pussy, I would be so fast to raise my hand and call a judge. That's just inappropriate and has no place anywhere in the game. It doesn't matter if you're at a kitchen table or at Eternal Weekend. Like, I would just if at home, tell the person, hey, that's not cool, don't say that again. at Eternal Weekend, raise your hand, call for a judge. It's that simple. And stuff like sleeveware, I actually think that's okay. Like, if your opponent has marked cards, because that's something that they can manipulate against you. And, like, just, it's not even a game loss. Like, they're going to tell your opponent to re-sleeve. Like, there's no harm in that. Like, calling a judge is not a bad thing. And then, as for people asking you questions on repeat, I used to have one opponent that used to do this a lot, like 5-10 years ago. And one day I was just like, I know what you're doing. Stop it. Either we can sit here until you're done, or we can continue playing the match. And it never happened again after that. Like, you just have to talk to these people like they're people. Be like, hey, I know what you're doing. It's not going to work on me. We can either like draw this right now, or we can continue playing the game. And it worked for me. I'm not going to say it will work for you 100% of the time, but the person across from you is a person. If you tell them that, hey, I'm grabbing the pussy isn't cool and it's not appropriate, they're going to listen. And if they don't, that's what the judge is there for. And, just never be afraid to call a judge. I didn't mention this in my report, but I had one opponent at Eternal Weekend ponder and quickly pick up 4 cards and then looked at me to see if I noticed. And I was just like, judge. Like, they didn't say a word for like a solid 3 seconds, and I like looked at them to see if they were going to call a judge. And sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's not. I'm not saying they purposely tried to cheat, but the fact that they looked at me meant that they knew. And the judges are there for a reason. Never be afraid to call them. I'm going to get off my chair now.
So I'll approach this from the judge perspective instead. So here are 2 phrases you can use to help out with your judge situations. So you call a judge and you say, can I speak to you away from the table? And that can give you an opportunity to say things outside of earshot of your opponent if you are uncomfortable having that conversation in front of your opponent. And the judge can handle that awkwardness. They can call in a head judge if necessary, if things get weird. The other thing is, you are allowed to call judges on games other than your own. You are perfectly within your right to say, hey, folks, I need you to pause your game. I am going to call a judge. Like, if someone is harassing someone in a game next to you, if someone is, using inappropriate language, or actively cheating, and you catch that, like, you are allowed to pause other people's games at regular REL. Competitive REL. You are not allowed to do that at professional REL.
I had that happen during my vintage event. My opponent had a Thalian play. I played a dig through time, delving an extra card. Someone watching says, you can't do that. And I was like, please don't interrupt my match. Feel free to call a judge. And then the judge came over. They paused our match. The judge told the person interrupting that they were obviously wrong. I got to resolve my dig through time, feeling like a genius. And then we went about our way. So there's no harm, but also people outside interfering, either just talking to you as a spectator, or like as a spectator talking to you. I don't want anyone potentially getting me a game loss for saying something about my game. So call a judge. Like, don't just interrupt my game. But also, people yucking it up around them was the comment in the question. If people are just chatting around me while I'm playing in a match at Eternal Weekend, I have no issue telling them, hey, do you mind just going somewhere else? And you can be polite about it. You don't have to be mean or nasty, but like, the place for the conversation is not right next to me when I'm playing a match.
Right. I think that there are 2 different questions here. There's one with several examples of people trying to do weird stuff to get advantage in the game. And then there's the one about grabbing the pussy, which I think are 2 different things. The people trying to get advantage, if it's weird little nitpicky nonsense, you could just play perfect. For what it's worth, if I called a judge every single time I had to correct an opponent, like, hey, Verdant Catacombs doesn't get plateau or whatever, like, or that costs 1 more, like, you have a Trinisphere in play, you need to pay 3 for that, like, oh yeah, sorry. Then I think I could, on average, win every match of Magic I play if I called a judge every time someone made a mistake, which might sound insane, but honestly, pay attention. If you call every single thing and follow the warning path up to a game loss, I think I could get a lot of free wins in a tournament. And I generally do just correct small things. But if you are the person who is in a winning position and your opponent tries to turn on the judge weapon, that's only a weapon if you are making mistakes, if your cards are marked, if you are not paying for your own Trinisphere or your own Thalia. Game rule violations are violations of the game rules. Don't break the game rules. Don't give them somewhere to go with that. In the instance of like asking the same repeated questions, you don't have to answer them. You can ignore them. You could freeze them out. Or like Bryant said, you could say, I know what you're doing. Stop or I'm going to call a judge. Like that is fine too. And the other one, there are types of humor, I guess we'll call it humor, where things you can do among your friends that you don't do elsewhere. We all have different thresholds. Jokes that I would make with my friends don't make it onto my YouTube channel. And that's just because you need to understand the audience. And the power of a person in a social setting saying, that's gross, knock it off, is not to be understated. And like clearly this person who is, grabbing the pussy, we keep saying that word, all-time record of saying that word on the Eternal Glory podcast. That person clearly has a history with their friends of getting a laugh when they do that. And they're taking the show on the road. They're on the big stage now. They're at Eternal Week, and I'm going to make so many strangers laugh with my stupid joke. And if those strangers either don't laugh or actively say, shut up, that's gross, that will stop very quickly. And if they decide to, buck up and say like, oh, you can't say nothing no more, I'm going to say whatever I want, that's when you could call a judge. And honestly, that person is gross. I can actually picture, I wasn't there, I don't know who this was, but I can picture one specific person in my mind who I could see making this joke. And I wonder if it was that person, honestly. I just have such a direct image when I read this question of exactly one person who is a longtime member of the Eternal community who would find this funny and would say it in public. And feel free to tell them it's gross.
I intervened in a situation at a tournament that I was at earlier this year where, someone kind of did a, slam their hands on the table. Like, I hope you expletives, can get yourselves out of this. You fucked us all over, yada, yada, yada. Looked at me, said, I hope you're not offended. And I said, I am. You need to stop this immediately. And I have never seen such a look of horror in someone's eyes, like where the first time they have been like confronted by someone for saying what they said. And it stopped immediately, like just immediate behavior change. I was an invited creator to this event. Like I had clout and he just got told by someone bigger than him, no, don't do that. And it was just a child getting smacked. Like, no, you don't get to put your hand in the cookie jar.
Yep, exactly. And just a little social resistance on things that are pretty obviously gross. And, why don't women play Magic? Here you go. This is why women love Magic, actually. If you go to Magic cons and go to like the commander tables and stuff, the male to female ratio is pretty respectable, actually, compared to competitive Magic, where barely existent, and power to the ones who push through having to sit around shit like grabbing the pussy. Like, dudes just say this stuff. It's gross. Why would they want to be in this environment? And here it is. Shut up. Don't do that shit. It's gross. And if you see that shit, tell them it's gross and they will stop. Or they'll get in a fight with you and they will be removed, which might be even better.
All right. With that being said, why don't we go ahead and start looking at EW Europe results? So just a quick note, I pulled all our data from MTG Top 8 here for these. It was missing one of the top 8 numbers, which we have manually filled in. If there's any other errors, that's on them. Top 8 here is Cephalid Breakfast, Esper Control, Nadu Elves, and by that I mean the Nadu version that is playing Natural Order for Craterhoof Behemoth, Ant, another Nadu Elves, Stifle Knot, and then 2 Blue-Black Reanimator.
That Stifle Knot person must have been incredibly good-looking and great at Magic. Just, wow. What a showing.
Yeah, I think they were very tall and popular on YouTube as well.
Must have been Bryant Cook.
That's what I heard.
All right. Looking at our top 32 here, we are looking at 7 Blue-Black Reanimator, 2 12 Post, 1 Mystic Forge, 1 Urzatron, and when I say that, yes, I do mean all of the Urza lands. All of them. 3 Cradle Control, 2 Nadu Elves, Bant Nadu, 2 Doomsday, 2 Dimir Tempo, lands, Sneak and Show, another Storm Deck, and Oops All Spells. If you were to continue to look at the top 64 beyond that, there's a very noticeable amount of 12-post, Demir Tempo, and Blue-Black Reanimator in the remainder of the top 64.
So last time for Pittsburgh Eternal Weekend, we talked about a lot about combo penetration. And this top 8 has Cephalid Breakfast, 2 Nadus, Ad Nauseam Tendrils, and 2 Blue-Black Reanimators. That is 6 of 8 of the top 8 are combo decks, which is something that we have identified as probably bad for Legacy in terms of how interesting can games really be if they are all decided somewhere around turn 2, whether the game has actually ended on turn 2 or if something like a protected One Ring has resolved or a Nadu is on the board and being targeted with Nomad. Those games are effectively over. And the 2 non-combo decks in the top 8 were both Esper. One of them was me with Stifle Knot, and the other was a wild, incredible build of Esper Control that I've never seen before and will probably never see again, but they somehow made it in.
So what I want to note here is these non-combo decks still both have combos in them, right? Like, a Stifle effect plus a Phyrexian Dreadnought is a combo. Hull Breacher or Narset plus Days Undoing is a combo. So even these decks that are playing fair by the format standards still have an A plus B finish that they can just, slam their foot on the gas pedal and say like, okay, game's over now. I'm not hitting you with the Baleful Strix for 10 turns.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely personally describe Stifle and Phyrexian Dreadnought as more of an interaction, a powerful interaction than a combo. Because, to me, a combo ends the game. Dreadnought puts the gas pedal on and gets the game over, but the Dreadnought resolves, your opponent gets a turn, you hit them once, slightly more than half their life total is gone, then they get another turn. That can be one over the top of, one Swords to Plowshares, one Fatal Push, one Beseiju, etc., turns that off, which is not true of any of the combo buttons present in any of the other decks. Even the Esper Control deck, I would consider Days Undoing plus Narset to be more of a combo finish than just putting a Dreadnought into play. The point does still stand that the 2 Esper decks both had serious gas pedals. If the coast was clear, they could turn the corner and win. Nobody is durdling around. There is no Jeskai control list playing 2 copies of 4th Aerlingus anywhere in sniffing distance of top 32 here.
So we're talking about combo decks right now, and one is noticeably absent. That would be Mystic Forge combo. They put 3 copies into top 8 of Eternal Weekend North America, 1 copy into top 32 of Eternal Weekend Europe. I saw some chatter online, and it was, if this deck's so good, why does Vexing Bauble need to be banned? Har, 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 har. Well, if you actually look at the data, it tells a different story. It was 5% of the field, and with a 54 win rate, it didn't punch through this event. Why is that? We don't know for certain, but one thing is true. The Nadu deck's win percentage going up this weekend probably has something to do with it because they have favorable matchups against the Mystic Forge combo decks. They don't care about the bobble as much. They can just win through it, stuff like that. And I think that isn't something that should be easily forgotten. I personally still feel like Vexing Bauble should be banned. Just because a deck didn't have another dominant finish doesn't mean it's not problematic for the format.
A quick aside here, a lot of the numbers that we are going to be mentioning in this upcoming section were sort of crunched and processed by Matt Chow. There's a really good post on the MTG Legacy subreddit that has all of their data. So check that out if you're interested in where we're getting these numbers from.
Yep. And while Mystic Forge did not break through into the top 8, it was definitely around. I'm speaking from anecdotal experience now, having been at the top tables throughout that entire event. And we have the data for the bigger picture, but I was surrounded all day by planar nexuses. They were all over the place. The colorless decks were out in force. The field seemed to be more interested in like big ramp style decks. There was a bunch of Post and this Tron deck. The Tron deck that Phil mentioned was my win-in round, and that was also a Vexing Bauble deck. I played against Doomsday featuring Vexing Bauble in this tournament, and like it was out. And the Nadu Elves deck putting up a 63 or 62.5% win rate across the field is probably a sign of doesn't care about Vexing Bauble, or Allosaurus Shepherd just powers through it and you end up being a faster deck. And being faster than Vexing Bauble or winning through your opponent's Vexing Bauble doesn't necessarily mean the format's healthy, is a really important thing. I watched one game happen. This was in Vintage, so a little different, but Stefan Schultz was playing his win-in versus Bug, and Bug had Stefan went land go, Bug had a Vexing Bauble, and then Stefan went land, Time Walk, draw another land, Dark Ritual, Doomsday, Cycle Street Wraith, win under the opponent's Vexing Bauble that they played on turn 1 that never are untapped with. They died with Force of Negation in their hand under their own Vexing Bauble. So, are we having fun yet? Obviously, Vintage is different. They've already restricted it there, but we saw the success of decks that just either punch through or play their own Vexing Baubles here.
Just kind of while we're on the topic of Nadu Elves still, Nadu Elves was the best Nadu deck over the weekend. The Cephalid Breakfast deck had a 52% win rate, and the Fairer Bant Nadu deck had a 49% win rate on the weekend. Let's revisit Dimir Reanimator now. So as of our last Eternal weekend, a lot of people were like, oh, it underperformed. I thought this was the boogeyman. Turns out Psychic Frog is fine. And now at this Eternal weekend, it was the most played deck in the field at about 12%. And then it boasted a 56% win rate over the weekend with very good top 32 penetration. That's 2 in the top 8, another 7 beyond that in the top 32.
But I thought it was fine, Phil.
Yeah, I'm sure it's fine. And then there is also the relatively large amount of like Dimir tempo and such that we also see if we kind of start looking at the bigger picture. Another 2 in the top 32. And it's a ton outside of that in the top 64. Like I think it's 3 in a row right outside the top 32.
With a 53% win rate as well. Like it wasn't slouching. Like it's just underneath the threshold, right?
Yeah, it had a decent weekend as well. Although Painter also had a pretty bad weekend. It was, I think, the second most popular deck at 7% of the field, but actually had a negative win rate on the weekend at 48%. It underperformed versus other Ancient Tomb decks and was losing to the Nadu decks all weekend.
Yeah, and we're seeing an adjustment here from Pittsburgh of the format did not correct itself to be anything healthy. We pivoted from losing to one combo deck to losing to a different combo deck because Magic the Gathering decks can't handle beating every combo that Legacy has to offer if Force of Will is not a card that is reliable in the format to check those things anymore. And this is kind of like rock, paper, scissors, but it's just rocks of various sizes smashing into each other. And if you just happen to like playing scissors, you can't, because all of the top decks are rocks at like control and mid-range. This Esper control deck that made the top 8, shout out to that hero, but it did, like Phil said, have its own kind of combo in there. And then top 32, Reanimator 12 Post, Mystic Forge, Tron, Cradle, Nadu Elves, Bant Nadu, Doomsday, Dimir Tempo, lands. Okay, there's one lands player at top 32. One person trying to play a medium to long game of Magic. Even lands can make a turn 2 Merit Lage, though, with their higher end or more aggressive crop rotation lines. Sneak and Show, Storm, Oops All Spells. This is pretty rancid for anyone who wants to play scissors in a rock, paper, scissors kind of metagame. This is a bunch of rocks and then like 3 or 4 papers that were meta calls and no scissors to be found.
I want to piggyback on one thing that Brian said here, and it's that you can't play Force of Will with the Vexing Bauble around. I don't think it's just Force of Will. Magic players have become accustomed to all of the pitch spells since the first Modern Horizons set, and Vexing Bauble was obviously a card designed to lower the percentage of those things and make them slightly less effective. And it was also designed, if I had to take a wild guess, for all the Cascade decks that were eventually banned out of Modern. And people complained that they didn't like the pitch spells, and Vexing Bauble was likely, there to make them worse. But in Legacy, if you're not playing Force of Will, you're probably playing Force of Vigor or some other free spell that allows you to be able to interact for free. And when you look at the top 8 of this event, there's 2 Nadu Elves decks. Okay, Nadu Elves, I haven't looked at these deck lists in particular, but I would guess that there's Force of Vigor in the sideboard. And if they're playing Alice or a Shepherd, that means that they could Force of Vigor through the Vexing Bauble, giving them an edge. And people right now are looking for those edges because you just took away the best way of combating some of this broken stuff with Vexing Bauble. Doomsday is one of the best decks at leveraging Vexing Bauble that isn't Mystic Fortune. That's why it's doing well. If you're not a Vexing Bauble deck right now, and you're a combo deck, you're sort of wondering, why am I playing this instead of something else?
Yeah, we have on this pod many times discussed the impact of Modern Horizons printings on Legacy. And it has been my position pretty steadily that it's mostly been slowing the format down, which is, not everyone likes that. I know, Bryant, you had strong opinions about Force Negation when it was printed and what that did to combo players and all of that. That's reasonable from that combo perspective. And traditional combo elves players really hated Plague Engineer. There's all these cards that really just stuff people who are up to no good. And the cards that were powerful and proactive and kind of broken going the other way, like Ragavan and Ren and Six, ended up banned. But those numbers are very small compared to the Force cycle, the Elemental cycle, except Grief, which was the proactive one. That one's banned. The other 4 are still fine. It's a steady drip of backstops of, if we want to slow down the people who are up to no good, we now have tools to do that. And Vexing Bauble looks like it would slow down the people who are up to no good, but it actually just turns off these whole last 6 years of printings of cards that are used to slow down the people who are up to no good. And the people who are up to no good are the ones playing Vexing Bauble.
So why don't we pivot now? Why don't we try to compare some things directly to the previous Eternal weekend? And I'm going to quote our previous episode here and then kind of evaluate how true the things we were saying last time still are. So, quote, "We are seeing relatively strong diversity, but the floor for what is currently acceptable to play in Legacy is still very high." End quote. How do we feel about this?
We sound so smart, Phil. Did we actually say that? That sounds incredibly intelligent.
Yeah, no, that's us. That's show notes from last episode. This one still very much rings true. We've already kind of said this in the episode, but Legacy has such a huge combo focus right now, and there's such abundantly clear pillars of the format right now. The blue-black shell with Psychic Frog, the fast mana decks utilizing Ancient Tomb or Dark Ritual or Gaia's Cradle, something like that. And Nadu, which is now a key card in what I would argue is 3 distinct archetypes, or maybe at least 3 distinct archetypes.
Right. This is something that I think reasonable people could argue that there are a dozen or so viable decks that could win a tournament here. The top 8 is diverse in terms of different decks represented across all 3 of the Eternal weekends. However, if we look at the structure of what these decks are doing, we're basically all just asking ourselves, how do we want to decide the game on turn 2? Whether it's with Tendrils of Agony or the One Ring or whatever it is, or Nadu, how do you want to decide a game on turn 2 proactively? And if we're willing to zoom out rather than zoom in, like zooming in, you see Cephalid Breakfast, which is a different deck than Dimir Reanimator, which is a different deck than Mystic Forge combo. Cool. Those are all different decks. If you zoom out, these are all decks just doing some bullshit very quickly with protection. And the people trying to do anything other than some quick bullshit with protection are not playing Legacy right now.
Yeah, I think if you want to play fun stuff in Legacy right now, you need to have an incredible feel for Legacy. You need to be a very good player. You need to really know your stuff. So a person like me or Brian, who is sleeving up a different deck every day for our YouTube videos, we might be successful in doing those recordings because we record at minimum 5 videos a week. You know, our floor is 25 matches a week. If you are the person showing up to your F&M once or twice a month to play Legacy when they offer that, you are maybe not going to have those same degree of edges, and you are probably just going to get beaten down by all of these faster decks. You don't have the ability to leverage skill in some of these games that are just so short.
Phil, was there a reason you left me out there? You don't think I have skill to leverage in games? What's going on, man?
Look, if one of us is piloting a ham sandwich, it's me. If someone else has a ham sandwich, it's Brian. And you're normally like, ugh, ew, smelly ancient tomb deck, powering out some 6-mana creature, keep it away.
Hey.
You're usually tamer in terms of taste.
That's true, but I played Radstorm a couple weeks ago, and let me tell you, that deck struggled to even get a game win. I know what it's like out there.
I want to add some context here as well to something that Phil said, which is like people like he and I who just play the format minimum 25 matches a week can experience success with weird stuff. My barrier for success is like 3-2 in a league. Like if I go 3-2 in a league with some mess that I'm sent, if I'm able to tune it up and play it tight and go 3-2, hell yeah, we did it. The league paid for itself. On to the next league. Moto Infinite. Moto Infinite is a significantly lower bar than Eternal Weekend top 8. Going 3-2, you're already out of top 8 contention before the Swiss rounds are half over. Both the US and Europe Eternal Weekends were 11 rounds. If you start out 3-2, you're dead. Like, that's the difference here. That's the important difference when we're talking about on a competitive, large Swiss tournament level. We're not talking about F&M or a Moto League with a flat prize structure where going 3-2 is profitable. This is a totally different thing that we're discussing. And we're talking about how do you actually win a real Legacy tournament with over 100 players in it right now. And it's not with anything that you'd be happy to go 3-2 in a league with.
A quick side note, there was somebody that was joining a bunch of different Discords today with a screenshot showing that 3-2 in a league right now is currently negative EV. So Magic Online economy, not great at the moment.
That notwithstanding, whatever. Wait, how is it possibly negative though? Like you literally get your entry fee back plus a treasure chest. Like even if unless they're charging you to have a treasure chest in your account, that can't be true. Or unless you're paying ticks to enter leagues, which you shouldn't be doing if you're infinite.
Yeah, I imagine that's what it must have been, is them using tickets instead of play points.
Okay, then they're already coming from the wrong place. That is not a person who's infinite on Moto, and I don't want to hear it. It's literally your money back plus a treasure chest to go 3-2. Shut up.
All right, so let's look at one of our other statements from last time. So at our previous Eternal Weekend, there were 0 copies of fair green mid-range decks like Maverick or Cradle Control. And this is no longer true. Cradle Control put up some results this weekend with 3 top 32 finishes. We are still seeing no like fair creature decks like Maverick or D&T in the top 32. And one person did put up a D&T top 64 finish.
How fair is Cradle Control right now? I'm pulling up I was enrolled in this tournament, so I can actually open it up on Melee and see lists. I'm just going to find the highest placing Cradle Control.
It's one of the 9 through 16s, Tobias Muckelberg. It has Natural Order. It has like Springheart Nantukos plus Gaia's Cradle to ramp big and quickly into it. It's still trying to do some of the fair White of the Reliquary stuff.
Okay, so we're still talking about a Natural Order deck with Atraxa in it. It is hard for me to call this a fair deck. And I think that the fact that we're even like, oh, it's just Atraxa and it's only off Natural Order. Like the fact that this is the frame that we are discussing from, it proves the problem, not disproves that there are other decks you could do. Yeah, Crater Hoof Behemoth, Atraxa, Natural Order, 4X Natural Order. This is a combo deck. I'm not having this in the fair greed pile.
I'm going to take the opposite opinion there. I think that Cradle Control is basically Maverick at this point, and Maverick is the fairest that you get in Legacy. It is just like, I would like to play with all these cards that were great a decade ago, and Cradle Control is the same vibe, but updated for modern era.
But this is the same thing we were already talking about, like the Esper Control deck that made top 8. Like, yeah, it's Esper Control, but they have Days Undoing and Narset in there. There is a combo finish among the cool, fair,
Okay.
1-for-1 or 2-for-1 exchanges they could do. Cradle Control is just non-blue Esper Control. It's the same thing.
I buy that, for certain. I do think it's like a fair deck, but it has the, tinker element to it.
Right. Yeah, so I reject the premise that Cradle Control belongs in the same bucket as like Maverick or a 4-color Zenith Loam style deck or Green-White Depths that we may have seen in the past. This is a combo deck.
All right. So one of the other things that we said kind of as an extension of this is that there were 0 creature decks like goblins or merfolk and also 0 8 cast. While that is true in the top 32, if you extend things out to the top 64, there was one Goblins deck from Goblins expert Eli Goings, who did put up a decent result. I think it was somewhere in the 40s as far as a finish goes. But the overwhelming combo presence in the metagame right now is likely very straining for anyone who wants to be playing fair creature-based Magic. And again, if you want to be doing artifact-based stuff, 8 cast is probably catching a lot of stray bullets from things like the Mystic Forge deck list, making it perhaps a poor choice.
I'll be honest. Even if Forge gets bobble banned, I don't think 8 cast is coming back. Like, as long as Orcish Bowmasters is legal, that deck stinks.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that.
I mean, how much Bowmasters do we even see right now? Like, that card has fallen a lot, right? Yeah.
Because it's too slow. Bowmasters is too slow for this format. Both me and the Esper Control player in the top 8, both of the Esper, the 2 people playing air quotes fair, we were playing 3 Ponders in our deck because the format is too fast for Ponder. Bowmaster is too slow. Ponder is too slow.
Phil, did they switch out our Brian Coval? Is this just like a robot? Like, this can't be the real Brian Coval. The real Brian Coval would never play 3 Ponder. What kind of number is that?
Well, there are 2. We all contain multitudes, and there is the online character Bosch and Roll, who Island Ponder keeps, and then there is the Magic player Brian Coval, who has 8 Eternal Weekend top 8s. And one of them will do whatever it takes to win, and the other will put 4 Ponders in a deck and die trying. So it's important to differentiate the 2 creatures that are in front of us. Also, I just want to shout out Eli on Goblins. He actually got 33rd, which I feel the pain of, having finished 33rd myself at an Eternal Weekend this season. Being the last person to not get a promo is a tough beat, and I know he was pretty upset about that. So sorry, Eli, but still a great showing with Goblins, and made a run at it.
Okay, just quickly filling in some data for a previous point. Yeah, Orcish Bowmasters is down to about 23% of the format right now, whereas previously on other episodes, I think when we looked it up, it had been around 40. Notably, Fairy Macabre, most commonly played creature in Legacy at 51% of decks.
Good sign.
That says something about the speed of the format.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to beat this dead horse. We've been covering it for weeks, but Surgical Extraction is too slow for the format. You need Fairy Macabre now. That's what we're talking about.
For what it's worth, I think, assuming that Psychic Frog goes on Monday, which they better effing do, I will be very upset if they don't, but assuming that Frog goes, I believe that Bowmasters will be the thing that slots right back in, and we will see Bowmasters at a high percentage of the format. That said, I wouldn't touch Bowmasters personally. I don't think it's one of the big problems of the format. I know that people aren't going to like hearing me say that, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, and that's another thing. It goes back to the conversation we were having about checking the people who are up to no good. And Bowmaster, I mean, it feels like we're just redoing a pod from a year ago, which we kind of are because the format got so fast with the Grief Rescaminator deck, and then whatever the fuck's going on now with Modern Horizons 3 breaking everything. Bowmaster has just been too slow for a year. And when the format slows down, hopefully with a barrage of bans on Monday, Bowmaster will come back. I don't think it is correct or useful to be like, yeah, all the spots for Psychic Frog are just going to be replaced with Bowmaster and we have the same metagame. Even if that's true, even if every Psychic Frog deck just replaces Psychic Frog with Bowmaster in the same number of copies, those decks will be worse and they will be slower, which is what we need out of these bans.
You remember when combat math mattered? I remember. Remember when Psychic Frog couldn't just wall your creature that you paid 4 or more mana for? I remember.
I was talking about this leading into Eternal Weekend, and why I ended up cutting Vexing Bauble is because I was testing Urza Saga, and I realized pretty quickly into my testing that construct tokens did not win fights against Psychic Frog. Like, you would spend 4 mana and get 2 creatures that were just worse than a Psychic Frog. And I was like, oh, this doesn't feel great, but I guess the suspend on Urza Saga is still good. And then people would just wasteland my Urza Saga on chapter 2, or they would consign to memory the 3rd chapter, and I was just like, what am I doing here? And to continue the piggyback on Brian's point, so let's assume Dimir Reanimator cuts, or, Frog leaves and they put in Orcish Bowmasters. That means that the 2-of package between Archon of Cruelty and Atraxa off of Entomb is no longer reliable if they accidentally draw one of them, which is one of the issues with Psychic Frog. So it's not just slotting in one and having the same stuff. That's not true even in the slightest. Like, use your brain a little bit.
Also, the blue count of the deck goes down by 4. Like, however many slots we lose and replace them with Bowmaster. Now Force of Will is harder to support. Also, if your opponent shoves turn 2 Psychic Frog, counters your removal spell, they are now snowballing. If they shove turn 2 Orcish Bowmaster, you could just take 2 for a couple of turns to hit your land drops, get ahead of days, maybe put a bigger creature in front of them, maybe pick it off with your own Bowmaster. It is so completely different, and play rate of the creature is not the thing that matters. The problem is not that there's a creature in 40% of decks. The problem is that that creature functionally wins the game on turn 2 if it's not checked, which is not true about Orcish Bowmasters unless you're playing High Tide or some shit where your hand's in the cookie jar. If you're planning on drawing 20 cards and playing 0 removal spells, you are up to no good, and we need Orcish Bowmaster to stop your ass.
Also, you can play around Orcish Bowmaster. You can't really play around Psychic Frog. You can wait on your cantrips. You can time your brainstorms differently to avoid just walking into an Orcish Bowmaster. You can wait until combat math is favorable for you to attack. You usually don't get to wait against Psychic Frog because waiting is negative for you. Like, they draw more cards, they spiral that advantage, the Psychic Frog gets bigger and bigger. Bowmasters is a really fair card.
Right, and I want to be perfectly clear because I remember the feedback we were getting a year ago, last time Bowmaster was at the top of the format. It was pretty aggressive. I had one person freak out and then quit my Patreon because I said, I don't think Bowmaster needs to be banned in Legacy. It's a passionate thing, and I hate Orcish Bowmaster. I want to be clear. I wish it was never printed. I am also exactly the person it punishes because I want to play 10 cantrips in a deck and then win with Uro or 4th Aeroligus. All of those play patterns are punished by Orcish Bowmasters. I am the one that this is targeted at. I love traditional combo elves. Forget about that with Bowmaster. Like, I don't like the card, but I also think it is pointed at the right people and at a rate that it is reasonable to play around or beat. And if you are feeling like Bowmaster is unbeatable, maybe you should stop shoving unprotected brainstorms into 2 open mana. Like, I'm just going to put that out there. This could be a massive skill diff thing, like skill testing, format knowledge thing. And yeah, it feels bad if you're out of gas against a Bowmaster and you draw brainstorm for turn. It feels really bad to cast that. But if you're out of gas against any creature, like, how'd the game get there? Was there no decision you could make? Did you mulligan to 1 and keep brainstorm, and then you drew your island, but it was too late because there's a Bowmaster in play? How did we get here? What happened in that entire game that this 1/1 creature is now has its foot on your throat? I'm just not buying it. And I, for one, would welcome a format that is slow enough that we're mad about Bowmasters again.
So there's a certain type of player that comes to mind, and Brian already described them when he was talking about, like, the High Tide player that wants to draw 20 cards per turn. But it's not always just the High Tide player. Like, some of the people that I know that are the loudest about Orcish Bowmaster are the people that are drawing their entire deck, like, using a control method. They're like, oh, all I want to do is draw cards. I want to draw with Jace, or I want to draw with this. I just like drawing cards, and they never play any actual real win conditions in their deck. Like, there's a bunch of these control players in Legacy community. I don't want to name them because that would be mean, but you know who you are. There's also some combo players that are very similar. They're like, I just want to draw my entire deck, and eventually I'll do some super convoluted win, but I just want to draw cards. It's like, well, yeah, drawing cards is cool, but so is just winning the game. Or you could just do something else. Like, that's completely fine. But you can't do something else against Psychic Frog. Like, that's just, like, not possible.
All right, for the sake of time here, I'm going to combine two of our points from the last episode. So we said that Control got bodied, and we said that Moon Stompy underperformed despite being one of the most popular decks in the room. And both of these things are still true. Blue-White Control was at a 43% win rate for the weekend, which was the same as last time around. And Moon Stompy got absolutely fucking crushed by Reanimator at this event with a 25% win rate in that matchup.
Gross. Yeah, that is really disappointing for the Moonstompy players.
Yeah, so luckily this format as is probably not going to last for very much longer, but like maybe put the Moonstompy down for a week, you know, if that is a realistic representation of what that matchup spread is going to look like. I don't know that I want to be jamming leagues with that right now. And similarly, control players, you're in a bad spot. You are not a major portion of this metagame at this time.
Yep, and that was part of my decision to play Stiflenaught in Prague. I don't want to play against Control. Control is the bad matchup there, and I think anyone would be very foolish to play Control. There are exploitable aspects of this metagame, like playing something like Stiflenaught with main deck consigned to memory and completely disrespecting Control with your list. That is something that an enterprising player could do and be rewarded with an Eternal Weekend top 8. Doesn't mean it's healthy, though.
All right, and last thing, quote from last time. Mystic Forge overperformed on the weekend, putting up an impressive 61% win rate and 3 players into the top 8, despite only 40 players being on the deck. This is now partially true. It became the 4th most played deck in the room, and instead of a 61% win rate, it now has a 54% win rate. So people either made some adjustments for the deck, learned some play patterns for the matchup, got their reps, were less off guard, some combination thereof. People were a little more ready for this deck last time, whereas it might have caught some people off guard at the previous Eternal Weekend.
Yeah, this is definitely a deck where knowing versus not knowing that it exists is a check, and then knowing versus not knowing how to play against it is another check. And everyone who is playing on Magic Online knew about Mystic Forge combo. We had covered it a month ago in our various pods, talking about it as a deck to watch. Bryant shouted it out as possibly a good choice for Eternal Weekend. And seeing it just dominate the field as it did took me back to the Initiative Eternal Weekend. Was that 2021, 22, whenever that was? I guess it was 22. And everybody playing Magic Online and paying attention to that stuff knew all about the Initiative. But I heard from several people, paper players in the room at Eternal Weekend, like, wow, my opponent just played some white creature against me and it just won the whole game. Like they had never even heard of it. And it really will separate the people who are out here listening to podcasts and grinding on Magic Online versus the people who just show up to Eternal Weekend. And it's really hard to ignore after it crushes Pittsburgh. I think even the more normal engagers with the format brought a few extra null rods or whatever.
All right, do we have any final thoughts here to wrap up the episode?
Wizards of the Coast, if you're listening, please do not botch this ban and restricted announcement.
Yeah, I agree. I do think it is cool that there are so many decks that you can play if you like super fast Magic. I don't think there is one single deck dominating everything. I just hope that is not interpreted as a sign of a healthy format inside the walls at Wizards of the Coast. And they do realize that these play patterns are just different flavors of the same poop stain.